Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Showtime number 300. Welcome in. It's a bit of an important date here on the Ledge. It's our 300th episode. Now, considering some other podcasts that are out there and have done, 1,500 episodes, that's one thing. But considering that we, usually only do this when the legislature is sitting, that's pretty good considering we started back in 2018. But I'm guessing that we have done more episodes of On the Ledge than the legislature has been sitting since 2018. But we'll leave it at that. It's also an important day to commemorate. And I just think we can't start without doing this.
And off the drop, McDavid went forward and nearly got a shot off. McCarr sends it around. Martin waiting. Connor McDavid scores! Connor McDavid for Canada!
Well, that felt good, right? Here we go. Everybody up late last night watching the game, and here we are. Everybody bright, wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, as Mum would say. John Tory is here, former mayor of the city of Toronto, our resident pollster and founder at On the Ledge. John Wright. Gerard Kennedy is here, along with Lindsay Broadhead, and of course Lindsay is a member of our comms and strategy team on Now and Next. So who didn't stay up? Anybody not make it to the overtime? I know I got a text from you, Gerard, saying pretty good game, and it was about 12:30. So
it was a good game.
It was
clearly
better
you
than
hung
pretty
in
good.
there.
It was a really good game.
Yeah, a little bit too good of a game. Would have been nicer if they put it away sooner, but yeah.
A nail biter. No nails left.
You know what I found interesting is that there was a piece, and it was it's called Inc. It's Best Workplaces. It's sort of a business newsletter south of the border. And this guy had been talking about, just top-notch sports and everything else. And then he kind of came to the realization it was Canada versus U.S. This is an American writer. And it dawned on him that the most important part of that game last night, John Wright, was that the players all lined up and shook hands after it was finished. And he found this remarkable and we take it for granted here in terms of the hockey tradition, but in all the other professional sports, nobody else does that. So he said it was probably a pretty good lesson with everything else that was going on in the background.
What a remarkable game. I mean, I'm old enough to remember in grade 10 watching the 1972 version.
Henderson scores!
Yeah, well, we were in Markham High School, had two cafeterias. They had the hot calf and the cold calf. The cold calf just had meat pies and everything else was cold, but then the hot calf was where if you wanted mac and cheese and all that other stuff, you used to go. They set up a TV in there, and so many of us crowded in there. And I thought to myself, it was a moment to remember, and we've had many others since. But I also saw last night a younger generation where so much was on the line in a very similar way. I mean, there was a feeling last night that it was similar to what I was feeling back in 1972, because it was our country against another country, and a country we really didn't know much about. In fact, if it hadn't been for Canada going in there in that series, we wouldn't have had television there. I mean, we used to have criminologists who would only see the Soviets come out once a year and try to determine what was going on. It was monumental. Last night, there was that spirit, and I know of our own kids who watched it, and our son who plays hockey had all of his buddies there. They were all gathered around in a very, very similar way. So I think this one will be remembered for generations as opposed to just another tournament, because there seemed to be a lot more at stake.
Yeah, John Tory, I heard somebody yesterday try to explain that, well, sports has nothing to do with politics. The 72 series was all about politics, and it was clearly, the front and foremost in everybody's mind, from the national anthems right through to the final goal.
I was just going to say it started with the national anthem and Chantal Kreviazuk changing the words, and went right through, as you say, until the end. And so the sad part of it, I was saying this morning on radio, I can't imagine what would have happened in terms of the national psyche if we'd lost. But, you have to also remember that it's a great thing. It made us all happy, it made us proud, but that in the end, it's not going to change any of these problems that exist. But it maybe sends a little bit of a message back. It's kind of a bit of a stick in the eye for those who would speculate on us being a 51st state or try to punish us in some way or other for for alleged misdeeds that are not true. So it was exciting and important, but we have to remember it's sports.
Well, okay, Gerard, but I could see that, it was just one of those things. And the sun came out today for the first time in this part of the world for a little while. So all of the things have worked together to kind of alleviate. We were talking about the anxiety and the stress of living with the news cycle right now.
Well, I think it's that. I think it's also the fact, sadly, there was some edge to this game. Playing the Americans felt a little bit too much like playing the old Soviet Union. And I think Canadians, yes, they're united. I don't think we thought of it as cathartic. I just think we thought of it as a good darn thing. Like, we're trying to find our bearings here in the upside down world that some people are trying to create. I wish people wouldn't pay as much attention. I think a lot of this is brinksmanship and silliness that, we have to see our way through to what's really going to matter. But I do think that there was a little bit of a temper of that in this. It wasn't just, yes, they shook hands, but there seems to be more going on, and the souring of our view of what used to be our good friend and neighbor to the south unequivocally has gained some caveats, and I hope that's not going to be ongoing. But certainly we got a number of months of this new administration to get through, and only because I don't think that's a Canadian kind of feature to sort of worry about that, but it is here now. And it was nice to see, as a Northern Manitoba boy who, we had French class off, John. That was what we got to watch 72. But also we're born and bred for hockey. I literally had, skates on as soon as I could, almost before I could walk. So, but I think this, I think it's something that shows some resilience on the part of Canadians. I don't think it really mattered if we'd won or lost. People don't invest that much in it. I think the fact that we were there, that we were competing, that we're together on this, I think that's what matters. And I think we'll continue to find ways to do that. Look at, if you're shopping these days, look at all the time people are taking and look at what's going on online, assessing where products come from and so on. So, I think you learn when you're elected, you trust the people that are out there. They know a lot better sometimes than the elected. And I think that's what's going on right now is Canadians are trying to find their way. And it's kind of cool to have it summarized for us last night, but that's all.
Well, Lindsay, the other part of that messaging in this whole thing, we alluded to the anthem and Chantal Kreviatsek changing that one line, and that just was an uproar on talk radio all day. But Wayne Gretzky's reception last night was a really interesting thing because, known to have been supportive of Donald Trump waving the flag for Gretzky to be the next prime minister. And the first thing I noticed is he gave the thumbs up to the American team. And I thought, well, where are the Canadians sitting? Why are they not getting it? Yeah. But he really people went to town on Gretzky last night.
As they should have, is my 2 cents there.
He wasn't wearing a Canadian sweater. I mean,
yeah,
what the heck?
I mean, look, he's still the great one. There's no battle there, but it extends into that, larger conversation that's often had around where's the line between where actors, athletes, famous people of any stripe, shouldn't they comment on the public space and politics? I don't know. I think we're learning now more than ever that's probably a dangerous game and not one worth tarnishing such a reputation as his over. But when you talk about where's the line between politics and sports, I mean, it depends how far you want to extend the metaphor. The hockey rink or, any stadium, it's an extension of the Roman Colosseum, right? This is where politics and sports actually did collide. And that is the narrative that keeps going. So it means nothing and it means everything, right? It means nothing. It's not going to cast a vote or change how Trump behaves. But if it can do a little notch in bringing Canadians together and reminding us what the flag's all about, bring it. It's great.
I think there's something else going on here. There's a poll out on Friday which shows 78% of Canadians that are engaged in this issue and they're doing things about it. We talked a couple of days ago about back in the 1990s when Canadians were frustrated about the issue of the environment and wanted to do something about it. And what came about was the blue box. They actually felt that they could have some kind of power over something that was overpowering them, taking that blue box out and separating out the glass from the plastics and doing what they could, once a week at least in 1991 and 92 when those blue box programs came in, were a catharsis. They were something that they could do. I don't think we should underestimate the visceral effect of what's going on. I mean, we can talk about sportsmanship and it may be un-Canadian, but on the other hand, we do have a president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, who is threatening us with tariffs, who are, threatening our way of life, who is challenging us and saying we're going to be the 51st state. And in fact, now what you see in this poll is that 50% of people, in fact, are buying in a particular way that they weren't before. 25% are canceling their trips, and which we've already seen show up in WestJet and Air Canada. So it's actually a reaction to somebody who has appeared now that 27% in a recent Leger poll believed to be an enemy country. And while we might all say, that's rather un-Canadian, we don't want it at the moment, it is an existential threat to many people. The question is how we respond to it. We talked a little bit yesterday in the podcast about whether or not we were going to lower our own internal tariffs, whether we were going to do something about it. That is the real question. It's not just the battle over a hockey game and how we feel about it, but how do we challenge the energy that we have through this to make a difference within our own country, to reach out to other trading partners, to make some changes that are necessary so that we can indemnify ourselves against what's happening and what we're being assaulted with. But I don't think we should underestimate how angry people are, how defensive they are at the moment, how they are wanting to do something. And if booing during a national anthem is an escape for some of them, well, maybe there's merit to it for many.
John Tory, the whole question of how we are feeling about this, this is pretty much with the exception of the attitude and the tone, we had the tariffs in 2018 or whatever it was in the first Trump administration. We did not respond this way. It's the way that they have been presented. And I've talked to a number of people, and I did a podcast last week with retired Major General Scott Clancy from the RCAF. Scott had done time as the director of operations at NORAD. So worked closely with the American military, et cetera, through the end of his career. And the phrase that he has used and folks he knows, certainly in the Canadian military, is betrayal. And I think that's why we're so pissed off.
I think Donald Trump, if you go back and look, the language of really trying to diminish and insult and disrespect Canada did not accompany a lot of what he was doing. He had more I'll call them allegedly substantive, reasons for doing what he was doing back then. Let's remember Richard Nixon way back when imposed a substantial surcharge on Canada and all the other countries at the time. But what was different both with Nixon and with Trump #1 was the lack of what now has been this incredibly disrespectful tone that he's adopted, even to the point of, as Lindsay was saying, threatening our sovereignty, as it were, and also, even disrespecting our leader. Look, whatever people may think of Justin Trudeau, he is still the Prime Minister of Canada, and we could never imagine, for example, him going around belittling, some other leader of some other country that is an ally and a friend. I can't even imagine being done to one that isn't an ally and a friend. And Trump has gone out of his way to sort of, even last night, the other day, invite Governor Trudeau to come. So I think that's number one. And I think the other thing, between 2019 and now, the mood of the public has changed a lot. I mean, the pandemic and all that followed it and all that accompanied it, the affordability crisis and so on, has made people angry. It has made them even more than angry, uncertain and fearful. And I think that then this kind of stuff that goes on in the U.S. plays into that. And you have a mood in the country that is way different than it was back in 2018, 2019. You can't underestimate that.
Well, I think there's probably a keyboard warrior already banging out a response to what you just said, because they'll be reminding us that Prime Minister Trudeau was admonishing the Americans for not electing a woman only a couple of months ago. So if he didn't do that, he came pretty close to admonishing, but was actually taking on the electorate. But I think you're right that there's this baked in fatigue and anxiety that's kind of come to the surface here that we're all trying to deal with and cope with. Against that backdrop, again, the premiers are, with a couple of exceptions, in Washington. I see we've got a new premier of Prince Edward Island this afternoon. And as today we noted, Danielle Smith from Alberta not going down to Washington. But it was interesting, just after we finished, John, you were talking about, let's look at the provincial trade barriers. The premier was holding his event in Milton, and he had a special guest.
How can it be easier to sell in another country than another province? It's absolutely ridiculous. I have a medical device company back home that says they would love to sell across Canada, but they don't have the time or energy to deal with the painful nuances of 13 different jurisdictions. In the US, they deal with one for the whole country. So stop and think about that. It's easier to sell in another country than in another province or territory. And we've all shaken our heads at this. We've talked about how silly it is, but nothing has changed. Well, it's time for things to change. It's time to protect Canadian companies by opening access to all 40 million Canadian consumers. Folks, there is no provincial or territorial government in this country that would put their citizens at risk. Could a meat pizza in Nova Scotia really be safe for Nova Scotians but not Ontarians? We've made laws and barriers that actually suggest that a frozen meat pizza made in Nova Scotia is safe for Nova Scotians but not Ontarians. Give me a break.
Yeah, Tim Houston from Nova Scotia, and he's down in Washington, Gerard with Ford making that pitch. But, you know, I think it's interesting to me to see how sharp that subject matter has become in the last week and a half, where a month ago, nobody was talking about that. The trade barriers interprovincially and how much of a difference it makes in GDP, et cetera. Houston is actually going to go back to Halifax and introduce legislation that will require, the barriers to come down as far as the Nova Scotians are concerned. So there's a real action there.
He won't do it unilaterally, and you do need the federal government involved because there are offsets. I mean, the reason the barriers are there is protect local jobs, protect local standards. Sadly, it even, discourages employment. But then at the same time, you don't want people raiding doctors, nurses, whatever. I'm not justified. I'm simply saying that because of this north-south trade that's been going on since '88, we haven't made this effort. We haven't needed to make this effort. And, there's some argument you want to hothouse your companies and let them, you don't want all the jobs to be in the largest parts of the country. But it can be done. We need the federal government to be involved to have it. I don't know what to make of Mr. Ford campaigning on, public interest issues, or the provinces campaigning on our international issues, because, that is what it is. We want them to be all on board. And by and large, there's been some good unity in that regard. But, I think we have to factor out the insults we're getting from Mr. Trump, and I care. Actually, I think he's given too much importance, but it is existential. The fact that we do depend on the U.S.'s permission for our economic order. I want to sort of, in the spirit of things, agree with Stephen Harper. I mean, we should be prepared to do what it takes, including, taking a knock to our standard of living, and be very clear in that regard. We are not giving up any of our sovereignty. It's not up to anyone else to tell us, or our prime minister, what they should be doing, what our priorities are. And I think Canadians, we've gotten a bit lulled by the cultural, overreach of the United States, as well as free trade. And I think we need to have our house in order. Absolutely. So I think there's some reason to do this now, and I think people will get to it. I don't think it's, my appreciation was not that difficult, but I do remember going to Manitoba, for example, trying to get an interest for an intertie for hydro when we're looking at banning coal in Ontario, and it was an informal meeting, but they wanted to charge us the U.S. price, and so that didn't make it very economic or very partnership in terms of what it is. So if those feelings can kind of change and we can work out a mutual interest, but yes, the provinces are going to look after their electorates. The federal government's got to help make this happen, do the offsets to help facilitate it so it can happen in real time. And urgency is something you don't want to waste. So this is something we can, I think, get addressed.
Yeah, Lindsay, the idea, I think, of everybody who's come to this subject matter in the last 2 weeks is we've been talking about this for years, and then they move into what it is we need to do. Premier Houston's the first one I've heard say, I'm going to introduce legislation. Now, realizing he can't do it on his own, but there has to be some legislative push behind this. You need to have the legislature, at least in Nova Scotia, to stand up and say, we're with you here.
Well, and maybe you just need a crisis like this to get rid of the inertia, because this has been a conversation for years. The inter-provincial trade issue, I've been hearing about it since I think I started working in Toronto, which is, not recently. So it's something that should be a non-starter. No doubt there are many complications. There'll be many specific sectors that are impacted in different ways, but this should be a non-starter. Many clients I've worked with over the years came from the States too, and they were in awe of the complicating factors in working in this province. And I'm sure it's similar in other provinces as well, but it's not easy to come here and do work. There's a lot of regulation, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of just things that American-based companies they're not challenged with, right? So it's opening our doors to other markets, realizing it won't be the American markets in this particular instance, but how do we make it easier to, again, get rid of that inertia for others to work with us? But we also need to be working together. It goes back to the hockey game, right? At a certain point, we're lined up shoulder to shoulder, provinces and territories, and we've got to find a way to lift each other up. It may cause pain in some areas, but the greater good is what the flag's about. And it's just this moment in time that we're seeming to realize it, because we knew it all academically beforehand.
John Tory, though, and I think Lindsay's hit on it, rather than the problem that I find we face more than not is it's about regulation. It's about, the standard for Nova Scotia is this, as opposed to having a national view of this and all agreed upon. So we've regulated ourselves in some cases into this problem.
Oh, definitely, but deliberately so. I mean, Premier Houston's example of the pizza. I mean, what really is the health difference? I mean, as it were, the safety difference between a pizza that is manufactured in Nova Scotia and deemed safe for them and maybe not for everybody else. That's just an artificial barrier. And look, when Lindsay says this has been around forever, I went to premiers conferences in the 1980s, and this was the number one item on the agenda. We've got to get those barriers down because it's stifling the economy. And so it's a matter of will. Regulations, as everybody in this panel knows, can be changed very quickly if a government is moved to do so. And the key will be developing the common regulation that everybody has in place that applies to a pizza or to anything else, so that these things can move back and forth and we can take these barriers down. I don't think that involves as much in terms of will as it does a bit of time to negotiate those regulations just so safety is preserved everywhere. But I think the will is there now, so it's a matter of getting on with it and doing it while the crisis is extant. Because if the crisis goes away, I have little doubt that we'd go back to sort of where we were, just everybody prefers to be seen to be protecting their own electorate, allegedly, which that really isn't what it's about.
Here we are. We're heading into the final week of the campaign, and as we speak, it was a couple of hours ago, Bonnie Crombie met with the media, et cetera, and had an event, I think it was here in Toronto, and finally unveiled the platform.
But I have some really great news. We are going to announce our platform today. Yeah. And I'm so proud of the work that we have done on our platform. Not a lot of it is new for you because it's things I've been speaking about the entire campaign, and it really focuses on the basics and getting the basics right for Ontarians, the things that matter, the priorities for Ontarians, right? And in fact, I'll even share that there are no new taxes. There are that's right, no tax increases. That's right. But there are no fantasy tunnels either, okay?
So when we look at it, it's a $65 billion in new spending over 4 years, $28 billion in efficiencies, whatever that happens to be, John Wright. But, I got to give them credit. They took advantage of the gap in the news cycle with the premier being in Washington. She commands the show today.
Yeah, and Merit Styles has also put out their costed platform. And so actually before coming on, I actually had a chance to read through both of them, believe it or not. And there's a few things that really strike me about all of this. First of all, the premier had said during the debate that, his job is not to raise taxes, it's to hold the line on everything and that way and give money back to people. Okay, so that's one approach to this. Bonnie Crombie has underplayed a hand here. Because if you actually look at the opening paragraphs of the costed platform, she says that there are no new taxes here. You go down into it, there are slashing taxes all over the place. I mean, this is something that that she started to talk about months ago, about the Liberals repositioning, giving money back. I'm not going to, raise taxes, but there's a whole section here about slashing taxes and giving money back to the public. Then you go over to Marit Stiles, and the tax issues there are quite significant, where you have the capital gains tax being increased from 50 to 80%, where you have different tax regimes that you would expect from an NDP play. So what I found interesting just on the platforms alone, I mean, you can get lost in all the details and how much we're going to spend and save, but it's very conservative, the liberal platform. It's got a cost controller who's going to come into play. There's a savings element to it where they're going to reallocate savings throughout the entire government and move them into a different kind of account. If you had to line all of the different parties up, their platform looks a lot more like a conservative government platform, whereas the current conservative government looks a lot more like a liberal platform, hold the taxes and reorient into some things, and then you get the NDP being where they are. The second thing was that Bonnie Crombie was at the Canadian Club, and I watched that speech as well. And for the first 7 or 8 minutes, I was with somebody and I listened to Bonnie Crombie, who it was like a TED Talk. The opening of her budget outline for her platform was very similar to the opening of the debate. Of the presentation, and it was really well done. I mean, we looked at each other, this other person and I, and said, "Where has this Bonnie Crombie come from? Like, where has she been hiding? She sounds premium-like. She sounds great." And then all of a sudden, in front of a business audience, went down this long tunnel that was pretty dark about her dad and how he'd been an addict. And she was wrapping around the whole mental health thing that OKIP was now going to cover, although I thought it was already. But went down this dark corridor and then emerged from it very quickly at the end and said, "And we're going to do this, this, this," and stopped. And I took it as a metaphor for this campaign. There's parts of this campaign that have come together. There's other parts that are still trying to work its way through, whether it's the candidate or the campaign execution itself. The budget, the platform that we see now for the Liberals is underplaying the tax cuts, even though when you get into it, it is a major shift. The speeches that she's given have at some points rung true, but then have gone off in directions which haven't stuck to the line. So I still think that this is Fortress Ford will remain as it is if everybody gets the vote out. I think the numbers today are 45% on average, which is 92 seats. The Liberals are up 28%, which could deliver up to 17 seats. And the NDP are down to 18%, which would only deliver about 13, and they may be losing a couple of candidates along the line. So the Liberals have done well, but the articulation of what the brand and who the brand is about is certainly a bit perplexing compared to what it was before this campaign started.
Yeah, Gerard, the dance around the taxes and how you manage the taxes and where the spending is, I think, has been a challenge for Crombie just up front, because immediately, even when she declared her candidacy to be leader, she was, too far right for some of the folks who wanted to get involved with the Liberal campaign.
Well, as someone who sometimes gets pegged with the label, I get a little tired of it. I mean, the fact is, being fiscally responsible is not a bad Liberal word at all. And finding savings, heck, I had to do that to pay for education stuff that I had to do. And I led a committee in doing that. I think it's more a question of, what John said about branding. And this is a very unfair election. And I still hope that people will apply some of that sense of unfairness, that Doug Ford has got his thumb on the scale here, that he's trying to take people's choice away from them, holding it in the middle of a winter, holding it when he done a huge amount of government advertising that he couldn't have done if he didn't pull a surprise election. And so they kind of need to make allowances perhaps for what Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie haven't had time to do. It isn't fair. It isn't giving, Mr. Ford his accountability for being in power, and it's not giving the opposition the kind of chance they would in a proper run-up, say, to October, that they would have had. But that is a lot to put on the electorate. I get that. I think that Ms. Crombie looks like a strong option. I think Ms. Stiles still, I think, isn't quite brought herself into focus. I think Mr. Ford, at least in the debate, kind of diminished himself a little. Otherwise, I don't think that's what's generally seen, but I was surprised that some of his confidence wasn't as clear cut and when he had to answer questions. So I think top line is where people are going to be. John, I hear what you're saying about the polling numbers. And I do appreciate that from the Liberal headquarters, maybe they're looking at, well, we need a lot of leaning NDP to come our way or something like that. Maybe that's why they're not talking as much about the numbers part. But you do got to pay for what you're doing. But, I remember the difference between our elections in 99, where we weren't quite ready, and 2003, where we were very, very ready. And I played, a small part in that and dug in on all kinds of things but if you're going to run that kind of election, you need time. We made announcements 6 months, a year ahead of time, because people needed a chance to look at, are you really going to move the numbers on healthcare, on education? Are those things actually going to happen? And we took the initiative away from what then was the Eves government. So, I think that disadvantage is to be expected. I think what matters now is what's the mood of people? Who are they going to trust? Is Mr. Ford successfully wrapped himself, as we saw in the video, in the Captain Canada sweater, or are people a little bit uneasy about that? Are there too many little deals going on, not little, big deals that have gone on? And is he the guy to be trusted, especially when he does this sneaky election? And I do think there will be some pushback on that. Will it come up through the snow and be presented at the polls, the advanced ones this weekend or the actual polling day? A little tough to say. Everybody in politics loves to see the tactics work out. But, for me, I do think that the public is smarter than that. I think they will do something that we aren't expecting yet. And we'll see who collects on that. I think Ms. Crombie's in a decent position. As a new person, I think that's still out. The goodwill is still there for her. I think her plus minus, if I'm not mistaken, John, is still better than the other leaders. Mm-hmm. And so that may just flow her way that way. Otherwise, we're all in this disadvantageous position. What the heck kind of election is this? Not quite a serious one.
I do want to get into the numbers heading into the final week in a second, but John Tory, just